Hello, celestial citizens. It has been about a week since my last Gothic literature video. For anyone who is new here, this is a segment on my channel where we pick a book, well, I pick a book anyway, that is of the genre Gothic literature, in case you couldn't tell, and I simultaneously read the story to you and try to kind of step-by-step walk you through it, help you understand how it is Gothic literature, which Gothic literature themes you can pick up while you're reading it. And this is for anyone who happens to really enjoy Gothic literature, as well as hopefully being educational and helpful to those of you who are maybe in a course in school right now and are struggling with it. Hopefully my kind of walking you through it will help you. If you have not seen my first video, be sure to do that because we are in part 2 of the Castle of Otranto right now. And if you've never read that story before, you're going to be extremely confused if you just dive in right now because a lot has happened. I'm not going to go over, any kind of overview as to what we've already discussed in this story because it's going to take too long. Instead, we're just going to dive right into it. "Villain, what sayest thou?" cried Manfred, starting from his trance in a tempest of rage and seizing the young man by the collar. "How darest thou utter such treason? Thy life shall pay for it." The spectators, who as little comprehended the cause of the prince's fury as all the rest they had seen, were at a loss to unravel this new circumstance. The young peasant himself was still astonished, not conceiving how he had offended the prince. Yet, recollecting himself with a mixture of grace and humility, he disengaged himself from Manfred's grip, and then with an obeisance which discovered more jealousy of innocence than dismay, he asked with respect of what he was guilty. Manfred, more enraged at the vigor, however decently exerted, with which the young man had shaken off his hold, than appeased by his submission, ordered his attendants to seize him, and if he had not been withheld by his friends whom he had invited to the nuptials, would have poignarded the peasant in their arms. During the altercation, some of the vulgar spectators had run to the great church, which stood near the castle, and came back open-mouthed, declaring that the helmet was missing from Alfonso's statue. Manfred, at this news, grew perfectly frantic, and as if sought a subject on which to vent the tempest within him, he rushed again to the young peasant, crying, "Villain, monster, sorcerer! 'Tis thou hast done this! 'Tis thou hast slain my son!" The mob, who wanted some object within the scope of their capacities on whom they might discharge their bewildered reasoning, caught the words from the mouth of their lord and re-echoed, "Aye, aye, 'tis he, 'tis he! He has stolen the helmet from good Alfonso's tomb, and dashed out the brains of the young prince with it," never reflecting how enormous the disproportion was between the marble helmet that had been in the church and that of the steel before their eyes, nor how impossible it was for a youth seemingly not 20 to wield a piece of armor of so prodigious a weight. So we're kind of returning back to a theme we saw in the first part of this series, which was mystery, element of mystery, kind of this like detective work happens in Gothic literature. We had a lot of the horror elements already in the first part, and a little bit of that has peeked through so far tonight with, the declaration that, the boy had bashed the prince's brains in. That's pretty graphic. But the mystery is kind of at the forefront right now. We have the prince, Manfred, wanting to find out who killed his son still. Like, somebody managed to hoist a giant metal helmet from the top of a statue, which, given the period in which this story takes place, I'm pretty sure it's safe to assume that this statue was up on some kind of pillar. And if you've seen a lot of these old statues, those pillars are pretty tall. They're like a good 6-7 feet, sometimes taller. So it was really up there. And somehow only the helmet detached from the rest of that statue and killed the young prince. And we're seeing something that bears a striking resemblance to real life when a tragedy strikes. Rather than slowing down and coming into this mystery with cold calculation and facts, everyone's emotional. Manfred is so horrified by the fact that he just lost his son, that he's just willing to blame anybody in his way right now. He doesn't recognize this villager, therefore you must be the one who's guilty, because even though I know there's no possible way that you could have climbed that statue and thrown down the helmet because it was too heavy for you to lift, I still need to direct my anger somewhere. And the story even says this much. It tells us that he knew full well, you know, really deep back, subconsciously in his brain, that this boy could not have killed his son, but he desperately needs to place the blame on someone so that he can hope to one day move on from this tragedy. Meanwhile, we have an angry mob beginning to appear. The attendants of the wedding, which never ended up happening for obvious reasons, don't even bother trying to draw their own conclusions. They're not even nearby at the start of this. They happen to hear Manfred freaking out and automatically just go along with him because they look up to him. Well, we look up to this guy. We've decided we want to follow him and pledge blind obedience to him. Therefore, whatever he says goes. So if he says that this random farm boy did it, the random farm boy did it. And sadly, we do see that sentiment in real life more frequently than we should. The folly of these ejaculations brought Manfred to himself. Yet whether provoked at the peasant having observed the resemblance between the two helmets, and thereby led to the farther discovery of the absence of that in the church, or wishing to bury any such rumor under such impertinent a supposition, he gravely pronounced that the young man was certainly a necromancer, and that till the church could take cognizance of the affair, he would have the magician, whom they had thus detected, kept prisoner under the helmet itself, which he ordered his attendants to raise and place on the young man under it, declaring he should be kept there without food, with which his own infernal art might furnish him. That escalated real quick. So not only do we have the, blind obedience of the mob, just listen to whatever Manfred has to say about the matter, and Manfred just in this blind fury and panic, blaming this kid who all he did was hear the commotion and he was curious and came as a spectator. That's literally all he did. And now everyone's decided he's a murderer. And where in a regular, fiction story, you would probably see the mob maybe, rustle him, get him kind of beaten up and stuff, take him to the jail, throw him in a cell, and then you have the guy stand trial throughout the following chapters. Because this is Gothic fiction, now we are marrying. That was probably inappropriate in the story. Now we are marrying the themes of the mystery and the supernatural and the horror. So we've got the mystery. We still don't know who managed to scale this giant statue and throw the helmet off with such force that it killed Manfred's son. We still have nobody bothering to actually carry out any real investigatory work. We just have people wanting to place their anger somewhere. So there's the mystery element. Then the supernatural element is the fact that these people just, again, out of nowhere, just because Manfred said so, have decided that this boy, really, they said he's not even 20 years old, this boy from a neighboring village, the only way he could have possibly thrown down the helmet and killed the prince is if he's a necromancer, if he used magic, dark magic, and the power of spirits, ghosts basically, to do his bidding for him. And again, this kind of echoes real life in a way. Like sometimes you see someone get accused of something, you're like, nothing's adding up here. Like, I get you're upset, but the more I'm looking at the evidence, the less sense it's making. But people will still just run with it because they need to latch on to something. And that's what's happening now. So we've got mystery. We've got the supernatural element of them thinking he's some kind of wizard or something. And then the horror aspect of this is the fact that rather than letting the law handle this, taking him to jail and then letting him stand a fair trial, they've decided, because we decided that you committed this crime with absolutely no proof, We're imprisoning you under the helmet that's probably got blood and nasties all over it from squashing the prince, with no food, no furnishings, no water, nothing. And since you're magic, you'll be fine. You'll just magic up everything that you could possibly need to survive. That's very horrifying. If you think like if this was real life, that would be just appalling to see. It was in vain for the youth to represent against this preposterous sentence. In vain did Manfred's friends endeavor to divert him from his savage and ill-grounded resolution. The generality were charmed with their lord's decision, which, to their apprehensions, carried great appearance of justice, as the magician was to be punished by the very instrument with which he had offended. Nor were they struck with the least compunction at the probability of the youth being starved, for they firmly believed that by his diabolical skill he could easily supply himself with nutriment. So nobody, not a single person in an entire wedding party, in an entire castle full of people, made any attempt to tell Manfred, maybe you're going a little bit too far. Maybe we don't have to do this to this kid. They all just, it's the obedience again. Manfred told us that he's a magician. He'll be fine. He'll be able to eat. He'll be okay. So now we've got everyone besides the kid, obviously, pleased with what has just happened, and the horror intensifies with the fact that these people legitimately believe that this villager is a supernatural entity. They firmly believe that justice was carried out fairly because, well, it's fair, isn't it, that if he killed the prince with the helmet, he's imprisoned under it, and he's going to be okay because he's magic. He'll just make food for himself. So we're going to spend the remainder of this story learning what happens to this poor kid under the helmet as a result of their way too swift action. Manfred thus saw his commands even cheerfully obeyed, and appointing a guard with strict orders to prevent any food being conveyed to the prisoner, he dismissed his friends and attendants and retired to his own chamber, after locking the gates of the castle, in which he suffered none but his domestic to remain. In the meantime, the care and zeal of the young ladies had brought the Princess Hippolyta to herself, who amidst the transports of her own sorrow frequently demanded news of her lord, would have dismissed her attendants to watch over him, and at least enjoyed Matilda to leave her and visit and comfort her father. Matilda, who wanted no affectionate duty to Manfred, though she trembled at his austerity, obeyed the orders of Hippolyta, whom she tenderly recommended to Isabella, and inquiring of the domestics of her father, was informed that he was retired to his chamber, and had commanded that nobody should have admittance to him. Concluding that he was immersed in sorrow for the death of her brother, and fearing to renew his tears by the sight of his sole remaining child, she hesitated whether she should break in upon his affliction, yet solicitude for him, backed by the commands of her mother, encouraged her to venture disobeying the orders he had given, a fault she had never been guilty of before. The gentle timidity of her nature made her pause for some minutes at his door. She heard him traverse his chamber backwards and forwards with disordered steps, a mood which increased her apprehensions. She was, however, just going to beg admittance, when Manfred suddenly opened the door, and as it was now twilight, concurring with the disorder of his mind, he did not distinguish the person, but asked eagerly who it was. Matilda replied, trembling, "My dearest father, it is I, your daughter." Manfred, stepping back hastily, cried, "Begone! I do not want a daughter!" and flinging back abruptly, clapped the door against the terrified Matilda. Poor Matilda. He's so horrible to her. She was too well acquainted with her father's impetuosity to venture a second intrusion. When she had a little recovered the shock of so bitter a reception, she wiped away her tears to prevent the additional stab that the knowledge of it would give to Hippolyta, who questioned her in the most anxious terms on the health of Manfred, and how he bore his loss. Matilda assured her he was well, and supported this misfortune with manly fortitude. "But will he not let me see him?" said Hippolyta mournfully. "Will he not permit me to blend my tears with his, and shed a mother's sorrows in the bosom of her lord? Or do you deceive me, Matilda? I know how Manfred doted on his son. Is not the stroke too heavy for him? Has he not sunk under it? You do not answer me. Alas, I dread the worst. Raise me, my maidens. I will see my lord. Bear me to him instantly. He is dearer to me than even my children." Matilda made signs to Isabella to prevent Hippolyta's rising, and both those lovely young women were using their gentle violence to stop and calm the princess, when a servant, on the part of Manfred, arrived and told Isabella that his lord demanded to speak with her. "With me?" cried Isabella. "Go," said Hippolyta, relieved by a message from her lord. "Manfred cannot support the sight of his own family. He thinks you less disordered than we are, and dreads the shock of my grief. Console him, dear Isabella, and tell him I will smother my own anguish rather than add to his." As it was now evening, the servant who conducted Isabella bore a torch for her. When they came to Manfred, who was walking impatiently about the gallery, he started and said hastily, "Take away the light and be gone!" Then, shutting the door impetuously, he flung himself upon a bench against the wall and bade Isabella sit by him. She obeyed, trembling. "I sent for you, lady," said he, and then stopped under great appearance of confusion. "My lord!" "Yes, I sent for you on a matter of great moment," resumed he. "Dry your tears, young lady. You have lost your bridegroom. Yes, cruel fate, and I have lost the hopes of my race. But Conrad was worthy of your beauty." "How, my lord?" said Isabella. "Sure you do not suspect me of not feeling the concern I ought. My duty and affection would have always—" "Think no more of him," interrupted Manfred. "He was a sickly, puny child, and heaven has perhaps taken him away that I might not trust the honors of my house on so frail a foundation. The line of Manfred calls for numerous supports. My foolish fondness for the boy blinded the eyes of my prudence, but it is better as it is. I hope in a few years to rejoice at the death of Conrad." Words cannot paint the astonishment of Isabella. At first she apprehended that grief had disordered Manfred's understanding. Her next thought suggested that this strange discourse was designed to ensnare her. She feared that Manfred had perceived her indifference for his son, and the consequence of the idea she replied, "Good my lord, do not doubt my tenderness. My heart would have accompanied my hand. Conrad would have engrossed all my care, and wherever fate shall dispose of me, I shall always cherish his memory, and regard your highness and the virtuous Hippolyta as my parents." "Curse on Hippolyta," cried Manfred. "Forget her from this moment as I do. In short, lady, you have missed a husband undeserving of your charms. Thy shall now be better disposed of. Instead of a sickly boy, you shall have a husband in the prime of his age, who will know how to value your beauties, and who may expect a numerous offspring." "Alas, my lord," said Isabella, "my mind is too sadly engrossed by the recent catastrophe in your family to think of another marriage. If even my father returns, and it shall be his pleasure, I shall obey, as I did when I consented to give my hand to your son, but until his return permit me to remain under your hospitable roof, and employ the melancholy hours in assuaging yours, Hippolyta's, and the fair Matilda's affliction." "I desire you once before," said Manfred angrily, "not to name that woman. From this hour she must be a stranger to you, as she must be to me. In short, Isabella, since I cannot give you my son, I offer you myself." "Heavens!" cried Isabella, waking from her delusion. "What do I hear? You? My lord, you? My father-in-law, the father of Conrad, the husband of the virtuous and tender Hippolyta?" Ooh. So that was a lot of reading, I know, but it was really hard to find a good stopping off point with that. So basically, we went back to Hippolyta, Conrad, the prince who died's mother, and she's still kind of freaking out, as one does when their son is squashed to death, and she wants to be consoled by her husband, as anybody would, but she also knows that his temper is so difficult to predict, and that the way he behaved in the garden is so strange and frightening that it's probably best that she doesn't go. Same with Matilda. Matilda was like, I don't know if I should go see him, but at the same time, my mother is worried about him, and I don't want this burden to fall on anybody else. So she just kind of, bites the bullet, so to speak, and goes to see him. Manfred completely wigs out because he treats her like crap. We established that in the first part of this series, that Manfred is just absolutely horrible to poor Matilda for literally no reason, because she was described as being very beautiful, and if he was intelligent at all, he would realize that you have a fertile, gorgeous daughter right now. If you married her off, not saying that's appropriate, but I mean, it happened in that time period. But if you marry her off, she'll have a bunch of kids with your name. The chances of her having a son are probably high because she's still young and she can have multiple children. But no, instead he's just upset that things didn't go exactly the way he wanted. But once Matilda comes back, and it's Isabella who is actually called in by Manfred himself, a servant is sent to collect her, we see that, you know, there's extra layers added now, because we clearly see from, you know, earlier readings in the last video and now, Isabella is terrified of Manfred. If she could have married Conrad and had nothing to ever do with Manfred again, she would have been very happy with that prospect. But unfortunately, she's the only one Manfred's willing to talk to right now, and he just made it very clear that whether Isabella wants it or not, she's going to become his wife. She's going to bear children for him, and she is completely horrified. So we have more of the horror element, which is this man is already very mentally unstable and very dangerous. I mean, we can assume he's very dangerous anyway, because as of right now, he's the only real suspect in this murder mystery. And we also have the horror that he has bad temper. He always gets what he wants. He wants Isabella. Isabella doesn't want him. Too bad for her. He's going to take her however he pleases. So there's a lot of that horror, plus what happened to poor Conrad. I mean, that's even more horror if it does turn out it was Manfred who had his own son killed, or who did kill his own son. That's just ghastly, especially given he basically blew him up with a chunk of a statue. So that's where we're going to leave this for now. I know it probably doesn't feel like I'm reading that much of each segment, but there is a lot to unpack in each small paragraph in this story, because, you know, the writer was fantastic at conveying everything that he wanted to convey. But hopefully you found this educational as well as entertaining, and as always, do something that makes you happy today, no matter what anyone else thinks about it, and I'll see you in the next video where we find out what Isabella is going to do.